I never thought a simple act of kindness would lead to this, but now I don't know if I can ever look at myself the same way again. It started with a knock. Late at night. Unexpected. I hesitated. Something in my gut told me this moment was different. That opening that door would change things. But I did it anyway. And there he was, my stepson's best friend. Soaked from the rain. Eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Sadness? Desperation? I should have turned him away. Called his parents. Sent him home. But I didn't. I let him in. Looking back, the signs were there. The tension. The unspoken words. The way his eyes held mine a little too long. But I ignored them. I only saw someone who needed me. And that was my first mistake. Before I tell you everything, don't forget to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga and turn on notifications. This story will leave you speechless. I closed the door behind him. The house felt different, heavier, like the walls knew something I didn't. He stood there, dripping onto the floor, shifting his weight like he wasn't sure if he should have come. I should have asked more questions, but I didn't. Instead, I handed him a towel and told him to sit. I was used to silence. It had become my companion. My husband and I used to talk about everything, about nothing. But over the years, the words had dried up, replaced by routine, by distance. He worked late, came home tired, barely looked at me anymore. If he did, it was out of obligation, not desire. I used to fight for his attention. I stopped when I realized I was fighting alone. My stepson was different. He had his own life, his own world. He was a good kid, but he never noticed the loneliness sitting in the same room as him. Why would he? He had his friends, his plans, his distractions. And then there was his best friend. He had been around for years, coming over after school, staying for dinner. I had always liked him, polite, soft-spoken, always saying thank you. But that night, he wasn't the same boy who used to laugh at the dinner table. He was something else now. He ran a hand through his wet hair, exhaling like he was holding something in. I didn't know where else to go, he finally said. His voice was low, strained. I should have asked why. I should have called someone. But instead, I just nodded. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The living room lamp cast a soft glow, making shadows stretch long across the floor. It should have felt warm, safe. But it didn't. It felt like something was shifting, like a line I couldn't see was being drawn in the air between us. He looked up at me then, and for the first time, I really saw him. Not as my stepson's friend. Not as the boy who used to sit at my kitchen counter eating cereal. He was older now, and his eyes held something that made my chest tighten. I swallowed hard. You can stay tonight, I said. I'll get you some dry clothes. I turned too quickly, needing space, needing air. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was nothing. Just kindness. Just helping someone who needed it. But deep down, I knew better. I pulled out an old t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants from my stepson's drawer. They weren't his, but he had let his best friend borrow clothes before. This time, it felt different. My hands hesitated over the fabric, my mind grasping at something I couldn't quite name. When I came back downstairs, he was still sitting there, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. His hair was damp, falling over his forehead, his shoulders slightly hunched like he was carrying something too heavy for his frame. I placed the clothes on the couch beside him. Here, they should fit. He looked up, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Just looked. I felt it in my stomach, something unsettling, something I should have ignored. Then he nodded, mumbled a quiet thanks, and took them. I turned away before I could let my thoughts go where they wanted to. I busied myself in the kitchen, filling the kettle, setting out a mug. You should change, I said over my shoulder. You'll get sick sitting in wet clothes. A few seconds passed. Then I heard him stand, the soft rustle of fabric as he gathered the clothes. Footsteps up the stairs. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. By the time he came back down, I had already made tea, the steam curling into the dim light of the kitchen. He hesitated at the doorway, rubbing his hand over the back of his neck. The oversized t-shirt made him look younger, more vulnerable, but the way he held himself was different. There was a weight in his stance, a quiet exhaustion in his expression. He sat down across from me, fingers wrapping around the mug. His hands were shaking, just slightly, but enough that I noticed. I reached across the table without thinking. Just a small touch, my fingers grazing the back of his hand. He stilled. So did I. It was barely a second, but in that second, everything shifted. I pulled my hand back quickly, wrapping it around my own mug as if that could undo what had just happened. He exhaled, staring down into the tea. "I didn't mean to show up like this," he said, voice low. I had nowhere else to go. I should have asked more. I should have pressed him for details. But instead, I nodded. "Then you did the right thing," I said softly. He lifted his gaze, meeting mine. His eyes dark, searching, holding something unspoken. I looked away first. The clock on the wall ticked, the only sound between us. I knew, in that moment, that something had started. Something I wouldn't be able to take back. I sat there, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, watching the steam rise and disappear into the air. The room was quiet, but not empty. There was something between us now, something I didn't want to name. I should have looked away, ended the night, told him to get some rest. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself asking, "Do you want to talk about it?" His fingers tapped against the ceramic, his jaw tightening. I could see the hesitation in his face, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. Then, his shoulders sagged, and the words started coming. He told me about his mother. How she had left when he was 12, how she packed her bags one night and never looked back. He talked about his father, if you could call him that. A man who only knew how to use his hands to break things, to break people. I tried to stay out of his way, he said, voice low, rough. But it didn't always work. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to say something, to offer words that would make it better, but I knew better than anyone some wounds never heal. I thought about the nights I spent alone in my own house, lying next to a man who barely noticed I was there. The way my husband used to hold me, touch me, look at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. That man was gone. Now, I was just someone he lived with. Someone he greeted in passing, a woman who made sure his clothes were clean and dinner was on the table. He had stopped seeing me, stopped caring. And somewhere along the way, I stopped caring too. I had been holding on to the idea that things would get better, that maybe one day he'd come home, pull me into his arms, and everything would feel right again. But that day never came. And sitting across from this boy, no, this man, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit. I wasn't just lonely. I was starving. Not for affection. Not for attention. For connection. And in him, I saw it. A reflection of everything I used to be. I swallowed hard, pushing those thoughts away, trying to remind myself that this was nothing. That I was just being kind, that he needed someone, and I happened to be there. That was all this was. Nothing more. He let out a shaky breath and looked up at me. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this." I forced a small smile. "Maybe because you've been carrying it alone for too long." His lips pressed together, his gaze holding mine for a second longer than it should have. Then, silence. Not the awkward kind. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that lingers. The kind that says more than words ever could. I stood up, needing to move, needing to break whatever was happening in that space between us. "You should get some rest," I said, my voice softer than I meant it to be. He nodded, but didn't move right away. Then, slowly, he pushed back his chair, stood up, and walked toward the stairs. He stopped at the first step, his hand resting on the railing. "Thank you," he said, turning his head just slightly, not quite looking at me, but not looking away either. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. As he disappeared down the hallway, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I told myself that was the end of it. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I expected him to leave. But he didn't. He lingered. At first, it was subtle, just small things that made it seem like he wasn't in a rush to go anywhere. He helped me clear the dishes after breakfast, stacked them neatly beside the sink like it was second nature. When I reached for a plate, our hands brushed. Neither of us moved right away. A second too long. A moment too quiet. I pulled away first, pretending I didn't notice. Pretending I didn't feel the warmth of his fingers, the way my skin tingled where he touched it. Later that day, I caught myself looking for him, listening for his voice, for the sound of his footsteps. My stepson was barely home, wrapped up in his own world, coming and going without much thought. My husband worked late, as always, distant even when he was present. But he was here. And somehow, his presence filled the empty spaces in the house that had been hollow for so long. He didn't just sit quietly, waiting for time to pass. He helped. He noticed things. The loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen, I had learned to ignore it, but he fixed it without asking. He reached up to grab things off high shelves before I even had to struggle. And then there were the compliments. Not grand, not rehearsed, just small, offhand remarks that settled into my skin and stayed there. This color looks nice on you. You make this house feel warm. You deserve someone who listens. They weren't flirtations. Not really. But they felt like something. Something I wasn't used to anymore. I laughed more in those days than I had in years. Not the polite kind. Not the forced kind, the real kind. The kind that came easily, unexpectedly. An inside joke here, a playful tease there. A shift. A slow, dangerous shift. One night, long after the house had gone quiet, I found myself awake, staring at the ceiling. My husband was beside me, his back turned, lost in sleep, or in whatever world he drifted to when he wasn't here. I got up. I don't know why. Maybe it was restlessness. Maybe it was something else. I padded down the hallway, past my stepson's empty room. I didn't expect to see anyone. I just wanted air, space. Then I saw the faint glow of light coming from the kitchen. He was there, sitting at the table, hands clasped, staring at nothing in particular. I almost turned back, almost convinced myself to walk away. But then he looked up. And that was it. I stepped inside. He smiled, but it was small, tired. Can't sleep? I shook my head, sliding into the chair across from him. For a while, neither of us spoke. The air was thick with something I didn't want to name. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Do you ever feel like you're screaming inside, but no one hears you?" I swallowed. Yes, every single day. But I didn't say that. I just nodded because I knew he understood. And then we talked. About nothing. About everything. About his past, his fears, the things that kept him up at night. About my life, my marriage, the slow, aching loneliness that had settled into my bones so long ago I barely noticed it anymore. There was no pretending here. No need to hide. For the first time in years, I felt seen. The space between us wasn't big, but it felt smaller as the night stretched on. The air heavier. The tension undeniable. But nothing happened. Not yet. When I finally stood to go back to bed, he reached out, just slightly, fingertips brushing my wrist. A silent question. A silent answer. Then, just as quickly, I pulled away. As I walked back to my room, my pulse thrummed in my ears. I told myself this was still nothing. That I was imagining things. That a line hadn't been crossed yet. But deep down, I knew. It was only a matter of time. The storm came suddenly. The kind that makes the air feel heavier before the first crack of thunder splits the sky. Rain pelted against the windows, steady, unrelenting. The house felt smaller, quieter, swallowed by the darkness when the power went out. The only light came from the occasional flash outside, illuminating the shadows in quick, fleeting bursts. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my husband's breathing steady beside me. He didn't stir, didn't notice the silence pressing in, the way the storm made everything feel still and waiting. I turned onto my side, trying to force sleep to come. But my mind wouldn't settle. Then I heard it. Soft, muffled, a sound barely there beneath the rain. At first, I thought I imagined it. Then it came again. A quiet, broken sound. I got up without thinking. My feet moved before I could stop them, before I could tell myself I shouldn't. The hallway was darker than usual, the kind of dark that made everything feel unfamiliar. I passed my stepson's door shut, undisturbed. I barely glanced at it before my feet carried me further. Then I stopped. His door was cracked open. And from inside, that sound again. Low. Pained. I stepped closer. My heart was already racing, but not from fear. Not from hesitation. I pushed the door open. He sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. His shoulders trembled. His breath came in uneven, ragged pulls. He didn't hear me at first. I could have turned back. I could have walked away, pretended I never heard him, never saw him like this. But I didn't. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. He looked up, startled. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face damp. He wiped at it quickly, as if ashamed. "I'm fine," he muttered, voice hoarse. He wasn't. I didn't say anything at first. Just moved closer, slowly, like I was approaching something fragile. Like one wrong move would make him disappear. Then, barely above a whisper, what happened? His jaw clenched. He looked away. Seconds passed. Then he exhaled, long and uneven. I don't know how to do this anymore," he said, his voice breaking at the edges. I swallowed hard. I had heard that voice before. In myself. That quiet kind of breaking. The one that doesn't shatter all at once but crumbles, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hold on to. I didn't think. I sat down beside him. Close. Close enough to feel his warmth, close enough that I could hear his unsteady breathing. My hand moved before my mind caught up. A small touch, just my fingers against his arm, just enough to let him know I was there. His breath hitched. He didn't move away. Then, slowly, so slowly, he turned to face me. His eyes searched mine, and I knew what he was looking for. Something to hold on to. Something safe. But I wasn't safe. Not for him. Not for myself. Still, I didn't pull away. His hand moved, hesitant, fingers grazing my wrist, barely there, but it was there. My pulse pounded. I could hear the storm outside, the rain against the windows, the distant rumble of thunder. Inside this room, it was quiet. Too quiet. A breath. A pause. A decision neither of us said out loud. Then, his lips brushed mine. A mistake. A line crossed. A door opened that could never be shut again. I should have stopped it. I didn't. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, unsure. A question. I answered it. And then it deepened. His hand moved to my face, fingers threading into my hair, pulling me closer. My body responded before my mind could catch up. My hands gripped his arms, my breath mixed with his. The world outside didn't exist. It was just this. Just us. A moment of pure, reckless desperation. Then a noise. The hallway. Footsteps. We froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. His breathing was uneven. The door was still cracked open. A shadow moved just beyond it. We pulled apart so fast it felt like gravity had snapped back into place. Reality crashed in, heavy and suffocating. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The footsteps hesitated, then kept moving. My stepson. I didn't breathe until I heard his door shut. The air between us was different now. Charged. Broken. I stood unsteady. My hands shook. I looked at him. He looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Then, before I could think, before I could do anything else, I turned and walked out. Back to my room. Back to my husband. Back to the life that, just moments ago, had ceased to exist. The next morning, everything felt different. The air was heavier, thick with something unspoken. I moved through the house the way I always did, coffee, breakfast, routine, but nothing felt the same. I could still feel the warmth of his skin, the press of his lips, the way the world had stopped for a moment and then crashed back down. I told myself to forget it, to bury it, to pretend. But then I saw him. He was already at the kitchen table when I walked in, sitting across from my stepson, stirring his spoon through a bowl of cereal without really eating. He didn't look up. Did he regret it? Did he hate me now? Or did he want more? I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. My husband was by the sink, scrolling through his phone, only half paying attention to the world around him. He barely glanced at me as I poured my coffee, just mumbled a tired morning. But when I sat down at the table, I felt it. He was avoiding me. Not obviously, not in a way anyone else would notice. But I noticed. The way his hands tensed when I sat near him. The way he kept his eyes down, his shoulders stiff. The way he felt me there but refused to acknowledge it. I wanted to speak. To say something. But what? I'm sorry? Do you regret it? I don't know what to do now. Instead, I just sipped my coffee, the heat doing nothing to melt the cold not forming in my stomach. Across the table, my stepson frowned. You okay, man? His best friend finally looked up, forcing a tight, barely there smile. Yeah, just didn't sleep much. Liar. Neither did I. But for a different reason. My stepson let it go, already distracted by his phone. I, on the other hand, couldn't move past the way his best friend's hands curled into fists beneath the table. My husband's voice cut through the tension. You feeling all right? I looked up, startled. He was watching me. Really watching me. His brows were slightly furrowed, as if he'd noticed something. I forced a smile. Yeah, just a little tired. His gaze lingered longer than it should have. Then, just like always, he looked away. I should have felt relieved. I didn't. Because it wasn't suspicion in his eyes. It wasn't jealousy. It was indifference. And somehow, that felt worse. The rest of breakfast passed in awkward silence. My stepson talked about his plans for the day, but his best friend barely responded. I barely ate. Every time I reached for something, the coffee pot, a napkin, the butter knife, he made sure our hands didn't touch. And that hurt more than it should have. When my stepson finally stood, stretching, I felt another wave of panic settle in. I gotta head out, he said. You coming? He was looking at his best friend. The moment stretched too long, too heavy. He hesitated. I saw it in his face. Then he forced a nod. Yeah, I'll grab my stuff. Something inside me twisted. I didn't want him to go. I needed him to. But before I could think, before I could stop myself, I got up and walked toward the sink. He passed behind me, and for a split second, I felt the heat of his body. Then, a whisper. Low. Almost inaudible. Was it a mistake? I froze. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. I couldn't answer. And then he was gone. The front door closed, and I was left standing in the kitchen, staring at the sink, my heart pounding. I should have felt relief. But all I felt was loss. The house felt hollow after he left. The silence wasn't new, I had lived in it for years. But now it felt different. He had changed it. Or maybe I had. I moved through my days like I always did. Coffee, chores, dinner. I went through the motions, trying to convince myself that nothing had happened, that nothing had changed. But everything had. And I couldn't escape it. I caught myself glancing at my phone, expecting a message that would never come. I listened for a knock at the door, knowing I'd never hear it. I avoided my reflection. Because when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the woman I thought I was. I saw someone reckless. Someone who had taken something fragile and ruined it. Was it loneliness? Was it a mistake? Or was it something I had been craving all along? I told myself it was better this way. That distance was the only way to fix what had already been broken. But the damage had been done. And it followed me everywhere. At night, I still felt the heat of his touch lingering on my skin. I still heard the way he whispered those words before he left. Was it a mistake? I didn't have an answer. And that terrified me. I avoided him. I had to. When he came by to see my stepson, I made excuses to leave the room. I didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge him. I thought if I ignored it long enough, it would go away. But every time I saw him, every time I felt his presence so close, yet untouchable, I realized something even worse. I didn't want it to go away. And that was the real betrayal. Not just to my husband. Not just to my family. But to myself. One night, Long after everyone had gone to bed, I walked into the kitchen. The dim glow from the streetlights outside barely lit the room, casting long, stretching shadows across the countertops. I was just reaching for a glass of water when I saw it. A folded note. My name on the front. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I hesitated. I already knew what it was, but I opened it anyway. The handwriting was slanted, hurried. I read the words once, then again. I'm leaving. I just wanted to say thank you. For seeing me when no one else did. For making me feel wanted, even for a moment. I won't forget you. My chest tightened. My hands gripped the paper like holding onto it could change something. I read it one more time. Then again. I felt everything all at once. Regret, guilt, longing, but most of all, loss. Because this wasn't just an ending. It was proof. Proof that I had let myself feel something I shouldn't have. Proof that, for a moment, I had needed it. And now it was too late. I sat there in the kitchen, staring at the note for what felt like hours. The words blurred together, but their meaning was sharp, cutting through every wall I had built to keep the truth out. I had spent so much time convincing myself that nothing had really happened. That I had controlled it. That I had stopped things before they could go too far. But reading his words, seeing the weight of them on the page, I couldn't deny it anymore. I had betrayed my family. I had betrayed myself. I never set out to cross a line. I never thought I would be the kind of person to do something like this. But the truth is, when you're drowning in loneliness, sometimes you reach for the nearest hand, no matter the consequences. And I reached. I reached without thinking, without stopping, without caring about what would come after. Now, here I was. Alone. Again. Only this time, it was different. Because now, I knew what it felt like to be seen again. And I knew what it felt like to lose it. If I had a chance to go back, would I change it? I don't know. Maybe that's the worst part. Maybe the real betrayal wasn't what I did, but that a part of me doesn't regret it. I wonder, have you ever been in a situation where emotions got the best of you? Where you felt something you weren't supposed to feel? What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. I promise you, this is only the beginning. Because loneliness is dangerous. It makes you see things that aren't there. And makes you do things you never thought you'd do. Be careful who you let into your heart.